Lakeland Currents, your public affairs program for north central Minnesota. Closed captioning is made possible by Bemidji Regional Airport, serving the region with daily flights to Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. More information available at bemidjiairport.org.
Welcome to Lakeland Currents. I'm your host, Todd Haugen. Our guest for this edition of Lakeland Currents is Anton Treuer. He's a professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University, also a noted author and speaker. And Tony, welcome to Lakeland Currents.
Thanks so much for having me.
Nice to have you here today. You sure have been a busy guy lately. You don't have to be any expert on social media, and I sure am not. But I see you on there speaking seemingly around the world.
Yes, I kind of sit on a three-legged stool. So one of the legs is really unrelated to my professional work. I'm just at the service of our Native communities in cultural work. Everything from naming ceremonies to traditional Ojibwe funerals and everything in between. It's probably a third of my time. It's all uncompensated and just in the traditions of our people. I spend about a third of my time doing my actual job, which is Professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University. I write books and so forth. And I probably spend about a third of my time speaking to Native history, sovereignty, but also issues of tackling tough problems in our world, race, gender, and trying to make the world a better place. To me, those are like three strands of a braid. They all, intersect with one another and feed one another.
Boy, there's plenty to talk about in this show. But I wanted to start by talking about the Ojibwe language and how you teach it and are very well versed in it. How's that going? Do you teach classes at BSU? Do you teach classes elsewhere?
Yes, so I teach at Bemidji State University. Now, all of my classes are taught through something called HiFlex, which means students can attend in person or by Zoom. And so I've got students from all over the place. So I've got high school students taking, PSEO from Onamia High School. I've got students out at Harvard and Vermont and all kinds of different places. And it's amazing the interest in the language. Ojibwe is a big group. There are probably 600,000 Ojibwe people on the planet. But we're geographically dispersed across several U.S. states and Canadian provinces. And now there's been an effort to really mobilize resources and build programs and things like that. I think something that might be a little more obvious to folks, we've had a lot of elders who've passed away. And every time someone goes, if they're taking something with them, it's a double tragedy. However, we've also been starting to do something that really hadn't been happening much since World War II, which is making great fluent speakers out of little kids. And that's happening not everywhere all at once, but where we have really good immersion schools and programs, we're seeing some dramatic success there. And, me working at the university level, I do sit on a school board for the world's first Ojibwe language immersion school. But I also do a lot of work developing books, tools, curriculum, resources, and training second language learners of Ojibwe to then populate the immersion schools and programs. Yeah.
Who are your students generally? It sounds like you really reach a lot of different age people.
I do. There are a lot of things I really love about working at Bemidji State University. For starters, most of my students, the overwhelming majority, are first-generation college students. Everybody who goes across that stage, of any racial group or whatever, it's a disruption, to the systemic barriers that people have faced. Education does help open doors. It's a tool in the toolbox, doesn't guarantee you an outcome, but it's easier to sculpt the outcome with the extra tools. And in addition to that, I would say for the Ojibwe language program, the overwhelming majority of the students are Native students from Red Lake, White Earth, and Leech Lake immediately in our area. We do have people who come from all over the place to take language classes. So it's still, a regional university kind of rooted in community, which is something that I think is a real strength for our particular program. There's probably more to say about what's the future of Bemidji State University and higher education and what are some of the trends there. But I do think it positions us for strength within, even the tough demographic situation we have there. But above all, my students have gone on to do so many amazing things. They're working in a lot of different language programs. A lot of the tribal leaders throughout Ojibwe country have come through Bemidji State University over the years. And to see not only the language, but the whole Indigenous Studies program and effort kind of supporting and equipping them for that kind of work is really heartening.
So why is it so important for people, all people, to learn more about the Ojibwe language and learn to speak it?
Oh, yes. I think sometimes there's an inclination a lot of people might have to say, oh, well, another language, that's cool, neat, or pretty, another pretty bird singing in the forest. And it would be nice to hear all the birds, but really, what's the value? How's it going to get you a job? Those kind of questions. And so a couple of things. First of all, something doesn't have to have economic value to have value. I think you can see this, and this is beyond even the Ojibwe experience, but we have 7,000 languages spoken on planet Earth. 2,500 are spoken only by elders. So in the likely lifetime of most of the people watching this show, we're going to see a whole bunch of languages go extinct. They're even worried about a language like Swedish, which is the official language for a whole country. And if you publish a book in Swedish, they'll put a copy in every library in the country. And they're worried about where do they end up a few hundred years from now, because everybody in Sweden speaks English. It's becoming this is ironic to say, lingua franca of business, even in Sweden, and it creates big challenges. And I think you can see this tension. I've never met an elder from any group who doesn't shake his or her head and go, kids these days. Because there's this tension about cultural change and continuity. Like, we want some changes, innovations in healthcare, better longevity, standard of living. We might have to make changes to make that happen. But at the same time, you can just see it seeps into American politics and around the world, this fear that things are changing too fast. The world that I know is disappearing. That, I don't know if my kids are going to have a better future or know who they are, and that everything's kind of getting smothered by globalization, colonization, all these sorts of things. So among the values for revitalizing a language, it does many things. Imagine the experience for people who are not from Northern Europe. And you're swimming in the sea of someone else's culture. And the only way that you can succeed is to be good at that. And you send your kids to school, and they're never going to hear about their ancestors, who also helped make this world a wonderful, beautiful place. And it kind of has you at odds with even things that could or should be helpful to and supportive of them. And so if we can shift education to be an opportunity for everybody to learn about themselves, as well as the rest of the world, then it does something positive for them, and it doesn't have them at war with themselves or the rest of the world. In addition to that, the effort for language revitalization pulls community together. And I think as human beings, we are hardwired to need connection, community, belonging, love. You can find this in many different ways. Honestly, even a sports team is a community of sorts in and of itself. But this is a form of community that's actually quite healthy. It supports tribal sovereignty. It does so many things. I can share a brief story. A few years ago, this is a couple years before the pandemic, I was brought to a meeting in Mille Lacs. And for those who don't know, Mille Lacs in central Minnesota, just a couple hours away from here, has been a really financially successful tribe. And so, for starters, they saved half of their money from the first dollar that came through from a casino. So now their endowment produces more money than casinos. They have a diversified business plan. They said, why are we sending all our money to a non-native bank? They bought the bank and they run a bank. They have a diversified business plan, operate businesses even in the Twin Cities. But then how they spent their money is really interesting too. You know, they put a fluent speaking elder in each classroom in the tribal school. They created an immersion nest. They put a beautiful ceremonial hall in each of their communities for their ceremonial drums. And I was brought to this meeting and they said, well, we have some money and we'd really like to think about workforce development. But instead of just training everybody to be a great gas station attendant, we do need gas station attendants too, but we want to train them for the jobs we really need. Jobs in language revitalization, curriculum development, all kinds of things. And we'd like to think more expansively about this. So I said, at that time they'd done a language survey and they had identified 25 remaining fluent speakers of Ojibwe in their community, and they were all over 70.
Wow.
I said, it's not likely that they're all going to go to college, get degrees, come back and run a new program. You're going to have to do something different. So I said, how about this? Let's develop Rosetta Stone, which is a language learning tool, kind of like Duolingo or Babbel, so it can work off of a computer or an app on a phone. And you know, let's also develop a literacy program where we can develop books in the Ojibwe language that can feed this effort so we can do literacy in our language with your speakers. And I was pitching all these ideas and they looked at each other and they said, well, let's do all of it. And so we got to work doing all of it. And I mean, there's more to say about even the nature of the contract and the details and copyrights. We had to sort through all kinds of things. I've done a lot of publishing work, so I convinced the Minnesota Historical Society to publish the books in Ojibwe, even though no one on their staff could read them, which is a pretty interesting vote of confidence in the effort. And, you know, the work is really incredible. So as we had to teach elders how to work through the pandemic by sending a grandchild and a computer to everyone's, you know, home. And sometimes there were all kinds of hilarious stories too about trying to, you know, acculturate them to computer work. We had 6 of those fluent speakers passed away. That was 20% of their fluent speakers during the pandemic. When we finally came out of it and could safely celebrate the books and the release of the new Rosetta Stone work and things like that, Joe Naquinabe is one of the spiritual leaders there. He had lost a brother and a sister to COVID. And we asked him to speak, and he kind of floored me. He said, you know, we've been through a lot. We've been through a lot the past few years. We've been through a lot the past few 100 years. But I have to say, seeing all of these young people coming around, seeing what we've been able to build, knowing that our elders will be teaching people our language for hundreds of years to come, I have to say that this has been the happiest time of my life. And then the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe can turn around and say, we hire many, many people to work for our tribe, native and non-native. We expect everybody who works here to demonstrate this level of competency in our tribal language. Here's the tool to do it. The assessments are built right in. You have 1 year from date of hire. Welcome to our sovereign nation. And so language revitalization's not just a bird in the forest. It's sovereignty, it's economic vitality, it's community cohesion. And on a Saturday night, when a lot of young people of any group might be looking for fun, their ceremonial dance halls are full of hundreds of people who are eating healthy food, moving to the music, from babies to elders, in their language and culture, forging community, and it's genuinely healthy.
What brought you to be interested in the Ojibwe language? Did you learn it as a child?
A bit of both. You know, my father was not native at all. He was an Austrian Jewish immigrant and survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. And he has an amazing story of his own. My mother grew up in Bena on the Leech Lake Reservation, and she had to struggle through poverty and so forth. Her mother had gone to residential boarding school, and so there was a break in the intergenerational transmission of our language in my family. My mother was on a relearning, reclaiming, reconnecting journey of her own as I was growing up. So I did get brought, you know, to ceremonies and have exposure to things, but My father spoke German and English. My mother spoke English and some Ojibwe. And so English was the language of the home and the language at school. And I finished high school with a plan to get out of town and never come back. And I finished college with a plan to come home and never leave. And I ended up, I probably upset my parents a little bit. I finished college and I said, I'm not going to take a job. And I'm also not going to graduate school. I'm going to walk the earth and hang out with my elders. And they said, oh, well, that's beautiful. Good luck paying for that because we're done. And so I did. And I ended up connecting with this guy named Archie Mose, who was born in 1901. He was 12 years old the first time he saw a white man, which was an American experience. And when I met him, he was watching WWF SmackDown on a TV in a little modern house, laughing really loud. But I went in to see him, and he just shut off the TV, and he said, I've been waiting for you. I said, what? How could you be waiting for me? You don't know who I am. But he had a dream. I looked like this person in his dream. For him, that was enough. So I ended up living on his couch, and I kind of had an immersion experience in our language and culture. I did apply myself, in all the other ways. I was, I'm probably a little OCD with just about everything I take on. It helps me get projects done, but I was really dedicated to my language learning work. I connected with Earl, who was teaching at Bemidji State University at the time. And I had a pretty intensive period, several years, where I was really working hard on it. And eventually, of course, I did have to take a job. And eventually I did go to graduate school. And I actually got a PhD in history. And I hadn't quite given myself permission to do language instruction yet. But I was recording elders, and I was transcribing, I was doing oral history work, and that came into some of my first books were history books. And then eventually I kind of morphed into a language guy. Today I'm really lucky. I don't feel very narrowly confined like a lot of people who do academic work. So I do Ojibwe language work, I do history work, I do kind of broad general reader type works, and I have my first novel out, so I just do what speaks to me and what I think will make a contribution.
All languages evolve.
They do, yeah.
How similar do you think the Ojibwe that you're speaking today is to what was spoken over 100 years ago?
That's a great question. So languages do change quickly, more quickly than most people realize. When I went to high school, they actually made us try to read Geoffrey Chaucer, who was one of the first people to write in English, and I could barely read that stuff. Oh ye, oh yea.
Right.
And he was only writing 600 years ago. And that's English, a language widely spoken and widely published in. So if you went back a few thousand years ago, you'd never understand anybody in England, right? And it's probably much the same with Ojibwe, where if you go back a few thousand years, the language has changed enough where it would be hard to understand one another. 100 years ago, probably would understand each other pretty well. But yeah, when you're going back some thousands of years, I think you would see quite a bit of change. It naturally happens with all languages.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell how different it might have been? Because the Ojibwe language didn't used to be written down, right?
Right. So certainly we can tell how different it was, 150 years ago, because people were writing things down then. And most of the changes are just lexical expansion to talk about new technologies, but the grammar hasn't really shifted so much. But it's a linguistic effort. Linguistics is not really language, it's the science of language. And they can actually, based upon modeling of how languages around the world have shifted and changed, make some good, guesses about what Ojibwe might have sounded like a very long time ago, which is both, fascinating to me, but also sometimes comical. Ojibwe now is what they call a lot of labials. It's towards the front of your mouth, like Gikawabamininim, right up here. So probably a couple thousand years ago, there was a lot more TH sounds. Probably sounded like people were spitting a lot.
Sure.
Yeah.
Immersion is a really effective way to learn the language, right? I mean, and that's kind of what you did.
Right. Learning a language takes time. A little baby hearing only one language is going to hear a whole year of the language before they say their first word. So you need a lot of airtime. So immersion does two things that are really helpful for language learning. One is you just log more airtime. Instead of taking the time, in English, for example, to say, here is how you say the word water, nibe. Say nibe, it's all English in one word, right? So you'd say, mio o nibe, giwi minakwe na nibe, and you immerse people in the language so they're getting reinforcement with everything you do. The other thing sometimes surprises people is that the best predictor of the language somebody will speak is not the language of their parents. And it is not the language of their school. It is the language of their peers. So this is what happens if somebody immigrates from a country where, English is not the language of origin to America, is the kids will speak their heritage language with the parents and they start going to school. But then they start speaking English with their friends. And then when they grow up, they're just as likely to marry somebody who doesn't even speak their heritage language. But even if they do, they might try to do that language at home, but the peer language for their kids becomes English. It's really a couple generations, and usually the heritage language starts to break down. So what immersion does is it's a little more effective at getting the peer language to be your target language.
A late great friend of mine, Larry Aiken from
Yes.
Leech Lake, tried to teach me some Ojibwe. I don't remember as much as I should. I remember Gisana for cold weather.
Yes, appropriate for today.
Yes. But I was just speaking with someone earlier today about the Ojibwe language, and he said, I'm hesitant to even attempt some of the things that I see that are written down in Ojibwe because they're very, very long words, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to say them wrong. Is that really, the words look so very long. Is that the way they really are spoken, or is that the way you think of them when you speak Ojibwe?
Oh yeah, so, if you, for example, take a big text or a speech somebody gives in Ojibwe and translate it into English, they'll be roughly the same length. Ojibwe is just a little bit longer. So it's not so much that everything is longer, but Ojibwe is what they call a polysynthetic language. So like your word, gisana, for example, it is cold. If you wanted to change things around to say it was cold, in English, those are all separate words. It was cold, 3 words. In Ojibwe, you're just adding something to the front, gi kisana. And so it keeps building out on both the front and back of words. So it looks much longer when you're looking at a single word, but really the amount of time it takes to say something is roughly the same. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we could do several different shows, Tony, I'm sure.
Sure.
But I mainly wanted to talk about the Ojibwe language. Mm-hmm. You have several books that you've written, some on the history of the Red Lake tribe, and one that we've done shows before together on called Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask. Mm-hmm. What kinds of reactions do you get from, especially that book, when you travel around?
Yeah, that one has been really well received. It first came out some years ago. Just last year we had a new edition of the book come out because so many things had happened. And then things just happened since we released the book, the pardoning of Leonard Peltier, things like that. And so, it'll be something that we'll probably re-up every so often. We did a young reader edition, which has taken me in front of a lot of young people, and that's been really exciting and heartening for me too. And one of the things that I think has really helped that particular book land well is that it's just hard talking about tough topics. Race, politics, gender, all these sorts of things. And I think it strikes a tone that is kind, welcoming, safe space. We're all in this together. This isn't about beating people up for all of our history, but it's about understanding our history and making things different going forward. And I think that tone usually lands pretty well with Native and non-Native folks. That it shouldn't be just a pat on the back and ignoring all the horrible things that humans have done to each other, But we're going to take an unflinching look at that, try to understand it more deeply, but really with the spirit of how can we make things different and better. And I don't know about you, but I'm a Native person. I grew up getting a sugar-coated version of Chris Columbus in the first Thanksgiving and very little else to more deeply understand this. So I think most people feel a little flat-footed around these topics. And we all have something to learn and we all have something to teach. So I think the tone helps and that it's also accessible. You know, it's not super academic and has been useful. So yeah, so I get lots and lots of questions and they range from searching to hilarious to deep to provocative. And it's been a lot of fun trying to figure them out. I always tell people, you know, I have a house full of Natives. I don't even know what they're thinking most of the time. I only represent myself. A lot of these topics, you might have a variety of opinions in the Native community. I think you'll find Native people who think very differently about any number of things.
Sure.
Just like white folk will think differently about any number of things. Sure.
That's just the way it goes. We have a minute left of our show today, Tony. Anything that you haven't gotten around to that you really wanted to bring up today?
Oh, you know, the brand new book is called Where Wolves Don't Die. It's my first work of fiction. That was a lot of fun working on that, and it's off to a great start. So I'm really hopeful for where that one will go. I've been really excited about some of the support that's been coming through for Native language work. Mackenzie Scott gave $1.5 million to the Ojibwe Immersion School. Wadukudading. We have a big grant that went to MEAN, which is a nonprofit organization for Ojibwe teacher training. Bemidji State University is going to be receiving about $1 million of that to get in the Ojibwe teacher training program business. There's a lot of really exciting stuff going on. I think for anybody listening, if you are interested in Ojibwe language, culture, history, it's pretty easy to find me, YouTube channel, social media, and at Bemidji State University.
That's it for this edition of Lakeland Currents. Thanks for watching.